Okay, guys, so we are on week 2 of the Once and Future King, talking through the life of David. So last week, we set up David's story by talking about where Israel was as a nation at this point in history. And so they have asked Samuel to give them a king. Saul is chosen as king, and it goes pretty poorly, pretty quickly. We talked about David being anointed as king over his brothers. So David is chosen as this king, but he's not king just quite yet. So at this point in David's life, kind of brings us to one of the most famous stories in the Bible, the story of David and Goliath. And, you know, it's such a common phrase now in even the sports world to describe underdog stories. Like, we all love sports. I know we probably used that phrase once or twice in our lives. But 1 Samuel 17 is where we find this story. And it really paints this incredible picture of the conflict, because you have the Israelites on one hill, you have the Philistines on another hill, and there's this valley in the middle between them where the battle is going to actually take place. And so for 40 days, every single day, this Philistine named Goliath comes to the center of this valley and basically challenges someone to come and fight him. And so the way this conflict works was that each side would send a champion to go fight, and whoever wins, that would decide the conflict. So it'd be like Brandon fighting for Israel, Derek fighting for Philistine, and you guys fighting to the death just to see who comes out on top.
That's week 3.
Week 3, right. But, you know, this is what's happening in this story. And so for 40 days, if you can imagine this giant coming out and just taunting the Israelites, and, you know, just that voice echoing across the valley, and they have to be terrified, right? But here's the problem. For 40 days, nobody wanted to fight Goliath. And you even have this King Saul, who has already been deemed like the strongest, the tallest, you know, the most handsome person in the land. And he's just sitting in his tent. Like, he's not doing really anything. And so he's even trying to bribe people to go fight this guy, which is crazy. And so this is going on for 40 days. Again, not great, because it just seems like this conflict's never going to end. But there is a hero of the story. So David arrives on the scene, and he sees that nobody's going to step up. He volunteers to fight, and then he goes out to face this giant. And so, you know, most of us know the end of this story, but let's kind of talk about these clear differences that we see already between Saul and David, because this is pretty soon after David has been anointed as king, and already you can see just how very different they are when approaching this conflict. So what do you guys see here?
Yeah, I think it's sad that Saul just allows this to go on, right? Because he, like you said, he has been chosen as king because he is the strongest, he is the tallest. And suddenly he's confronted with this literal giant. And he's like, well, like, no, I'm not that tall. Like, I'm not going out there. And for like a month, over a month, he lets this go on and lets Goliath come out and curse Israel and curse God. And the very first time David hears it, he's like, oh no. Like, oh no, we don't do this. Like, he is talking bad about God's people. He is talking bad about God. Someone needs to go out there and shut him up and show him who our God is. And it's just crazy to me to think about how the king of Israel is allowing this to happen, not only to his nation, but to his God. And a teenage boy shows up and is immediately passionate about, no, like, we got to make this stop. And Saul lets him go. Like, this little scrawny kid, he's like, okay, well, you can go fight him. That's fine. I mean, it's amazing when you think about it like that.
Yeah.
Well, for sure. Yeah, and I think it shows that not only David's heart and his courage, but that the Spirit of the Lord was on him, right? Because you kind of look at the juxtaposition of this army of, you know, I'm sure mature Israelites looking at this giant. You have the king in Saul looking at this giant. And yet the one person who, again, is offended that no matter who it is talking poorly of his God is the one that doesn't even fit in the king's armor.
Yeah.
You know, and you know, I think we'll continue to see a thread over the next couple of weeks of this study that, you know, David's heart and Saul's heart are different. Yeah. Like, they're different, and their failures may be different, but who they are couldn't be more different than one another.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite parts of the story, actually, Derek, is when he doesn't fit in the king's armor. Because I think it's just so true of sometimes we try to put ourselves in places that God does not want us to be in, right? Like, he was trying to fit into this mold that the people wanted him to be. But he even says, like, I'm not used to this armor. I'm just going to go out and be who God created me to be. And I think we see that too throughout the course of his life. Like his heart is just so different than Saul's in this moment. You see he doesn't even have a sword, right? He brings the 5 stones, his little slingshot. And so he's just being who God has called him to be. And he slays this giant. And there's also a little moment that I love that because he didn't have a sword, he actually takes Goliath's sword and cuts his own head off. So that has to be pretty humiliating for the Philistines in that moment.
And they don't put that part on like the flannel graph story, right? Here's Goliath's head, guys. Right, this is what happens.
But yeah, this story, I think, we know most of it, right? Because a lot of us who have grown up in church, have had the flannel grass and know this story. But man, I just think it is such a marker for the stories of both Saul and David.
Oh, yeah.
Because it shows that Saul is so cowardly, and that ends up marking all of his reign. We see this insecurity and this jealousy really play out, and we'll see that over the next few weeks of this study. He is just consumed, and he just lets it eat him alive. But it also ends up marking David as king, because it really shows him as one who is fighting for the Lord, and he has such confidence in the power of God and what he can do. And so this conflict between David and Goliath and what happens actually sets up this rift that we will see between Saul and David. And so, this story is so familiar to us, but how do you guys identify with this story? Maybe even reading it again as we've prepared for this. So what's the really big picture for us to take away?
Yeah. I think there's the temptation whenever we read stories like this to put ourselves in the shoes of David or the sandals of David or whatever you want to say. And, there's certainly an element of that the Bible encourages us to do, right? When Hebrews chapter 11 goes through the heroes of the faith, it says, hey, consider what these people did because they believed in God. So certainly we should look at that and say, okay, well, I should be like David. When I see something that is against God's people or against God's character, I should stand up for that. Absolutely. But there's also an element in which we need to understand that in this story, we are not David so much, right? There's an interesting picture that the Hebrew uses. You talked earlier, Sarah, about that. The 2 valleys or the 2 hills, and then the valley in between that Goliath comes out. The word that's used for champion there, because it's representative warfare, is what they're talking about. The word that's used for champion is the word. It literally means man of the in between. There is something that is standing in between God's people and where they want to go, and so we need someone to go out there and fight that person. And I think it's no coincidence that Goliath is described in very snake-like terms. The armor that he's said to wear is described as having scales, which is a word that's used of the snake in Genesis chapter 3. And so I think it's painting this picture of David as the anointed one who is going out to crush the head, literally, of the snake. And so we're getting, even early in David's life, this picture of Jesus, right? That there is this man in between. There's a man of the in-between who will go and stand against the enemies of God, the enemies of God's people, and will emerge victorious because he has been anointed by God. And I think that's such an encouraging and challenging picture for us to think about, that in this story, we're not so much David, even though we should aspire to that level of faith, We are the people who need deliverance. We're the people who need someone to come cut the head off the snake. And we're going to get that in King Jesus.
For sure. And I think, one of the other themes of this, yet again, in the Old Testament is that God will fight our battles, right? God will go before us. And I wouldn't even say God's going to fight our battles, right? He's going to fight the battles that are going to accomplish his purposes. Because I think a lot of times we think if God would just do this for me, if he would just go ahead of me in this, well, sometimes that's not a part of God's purpose for our life. And I think one of the biggest things to realize here in 17 verse 45, it says, David said to the Philistine, you have come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defiled. And then in verse 47, he says, all those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, but for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands. And so it's just yet another moment, almost all the way back in Egypt, right, when they were in captivity, that the Lord was showing his power. And you fast forward to them, going into the promised land. They didn't just gracefully walk into this land that was promised to them. They had to conquer, right? But it was the Lord that was going ahead of them. And I think this is yet another reminder that Like, God will be the one who will accomplish his purposes. And whoever he uses is whoever he uses. But he will be the one that accomplishes it.